The disciples gathered under the Bodhi tree, the air filled with a quiet anticipation. Ananda was the first to speak. "Master," he began, his voice tinged with hesitation, "can freedom truly exist in a world bound by suffering?" The Buddha's gaze rested on him, calm and unwavering. "Ananda, the question you ask is the root of much inquiry." The disciples leaned closer, drawn by the depth of his voice. Freedom is not the absence of ties. It is the understanding of their nature. The branches above swayed gently, their shadows dancing on the ground. "Let us begin with the wind," the Buddha continued, his words deliberate. "It moves without resistance, though met with barriers." One disciple, curious, interjected, "Does it not struggle to pass through obstacles?" The Buddha smiled faintly, a lightness touching his face. "No, it flows because it does not fight what is." The group fell silent, contemplating his words. "Consider the bird," the Buddha said, gesturing upwards. "Does it see the vast sky as its limit or its freedom?" Ananda's brow furrowed as he spoke. "Perhaps it fears what it does not know, mistaking freedom for uncertainty." The Buddha nodded gently. "Indeed, freedom and fear often appear intertwined, but understanding dissolves fear." The disciples shifted, some murmuring softly among themselves. "Freedom begins in the mind," the Buddha said firmly. "The mind creates, binds, and releases. Observe its workings and find liberation." A disciple named Mara raised his hand, his expression hesitant. "Master, what of the suffering we feel? It binds us so tightly." The Buddha turned to Mara, his gaze steady and compassionate. "Mara, suffering is born of attachment. Understand this, and the binding lessens." Mara looked down, his hands clasped together, uncertainty in his face. "Let me share a story," the Buddha said, his tone inviting. "Once, there was a bird who feared the sky's vastness." The disciples listened intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and reflection. "This bird," he continued, "saw the expanse above as a cage, not realizing its own wings were its keys." Ananda's voice broke the quiet. "But Master, what of those who do not see their wings?" The Buddha paused, his silence deliberate. "Then they must first learn to see themselves clearly. Self-knowledge is the first step to freedom." The disciples exchanged glances, their thoughts visible in the flicker of their eyes. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying the scent of nearby blooms. The bird eventually looked inward, the Buddha said, resuming. In doing so, it discovered the truth of its own power. Another disciple spoke, her tone uncertain. "But Master, how do we look inward amidst the noise of the world?" The Buddha's face softened, a profound understanding in his gaze. "Silence is not found outside," he replied. "Silence is cultivated within. It is the doorway to understanding." The group sat quietly, the stillness a shared reflection of his words. "Now," the Buddha said, his tone lifting slightly, "let us examine a simple practice. Sit still, observe your breath, and listen." The disciples complied, their movements deliberate and subdued. As they sat, the world around them seemed to fade, replaced by an encompassing quiet. The Buddha's voice broke the silence softly. "Notice how the breath moves. It binds to nothing and flows naturally." One disciple, his face relaxed but thoughtful, spoke, "Master, I feel the breath, but my thoughts remain noisy." The Buddha nodded. "Thoughts are clouds in the mind's sky. Observe them without attachment." The disciple nodded slowly, his hands resting in his lap. "Master, is the mind's sky ever truly clear?" The Buddha's eyes met his, kind but firm. "Clarity comes not from absence but from presence. Be with what is." The gathering lasted as the sun reached its zenith, casting warm rays upon the earth. "Freedom," the Buddha concluded, "is not an end but a way of being." The disciples rose gradually, their steps unhurried. Ananda approached the Buddha, a newfound resolve in his eyes. "Thank you, Master," he said, his voice steady. The Buddha inclined his head, a smile softening his features, and so, the teachings of the day lingered in the disciples' hearts. Seeds awaiting growth. Another day, under the vast shade of the Bodhi tree, the disciples gathered, their expressions marked by struggle and curiosity. Mara spoke first, his voice heavy. "Master, I feel bound by thoughts and emotions that refuse to leave me." The Buddha's gaze rested on Mara. With deep compassion, "Mara, these bindings you describe are not external chains but illusions of the mind." The breeze stirred, softly, carrying the scent of blossoms nearby. Mara continued, "Master, my fears and desires weigh me down, pulling me away from freedom." The Buddha inclined his head slightly, his voice calm. "Fears and desires grow from attachment. Observe their roots and the weight begins to lessen." Mara's eyes remained fixed on the ground, his fingers trembling lightly. "But Master, how do we release what feels so entwined with our being?" The Buddha gestured to the pond nearby, his movements deliberate. "Look at the surface of the water, Mara. It reflects the sky, but it is not bound by the sky." The disciples turned their gazes to the pond, their reflections mingling with the moonlight. Mara nodded slowly, uncertainty lingering. "Master, the sky is clear now, but when clouds appear, the water reflects them. Does that bind it?" The Buddha's voice carried warmth and clarity. "Clouds come and go, as do thoughts and emotions. They do not change the water's nature." Ananda joined the conversation, his tone curious. "Master, the water accepts all reflections without resistance. Is this how we must approach our thoughts?" The Buddha smiled gently, a light of approval in his expression. "Acceptance without clinging is key. Ananda, this is the practice of freedom." The group fell into a meditative silence, contemplating his words. Mara's voice broke the quiet again. "Master, my suffering feels constant. How can I see it as fleeting clouds?" The Buddha nodded, his gaze steady. "Mara, let us examine suffering. Sit with it, observe its arising, and notice its passing." The disciples settled into meditation, the stillness of the forest blending with their introspection. Mara sat as instructed, his breaths deepening with the effort of focus. The Buddha's voice interrupted softly, guiding them. "Suffering arises from attachment. See it as a visitor, not as a permanent resident." A disciple named Kala raised her hand, her tone hesitant. "Master, I fear that releasing suffering might mean losing parts of myself. Is this true?" The Buddha's gaze rested on Kala, his voice measured. "Kala, holding on to suffering does not make you whole. Freedom reveals your true self." Kala nodded, her expression thoughtful, her hands relaxed in her lap. Another disciple added, "Master, suffering feels real, tangible even. How do we see it as illusion?" The Buddha's gaze swept across the group. "Illusion feels real until understood. Awareness dissolves its grip, unveiling the heart's truth." The disciples sat quietly, their focus sharpening on the simplicity of his words. Mara spoke once more, his voice steadying. "Master, observing suffering feels freeing, but it also feels incomplete. What follows observation?" The Buddha smiled faintly, his tone lifting. "Understanding follows. Understanding transforms the heart's response." The sun's rays began to soften, the day transitioning into dusk. The Buddha's voice broke the fading light. Freedom is not rejecting suffering, but engaging with it fully to understand its impermanence. Mara's shoulders relaxed, his breath flowing naturally as he absorbed the teaching. The disciples looked to the Buddha, questions lingering in their expressions. He spoke again. "The heart gains freedom through wisdom, mindfulness, and compassion. These are the tools to release the bonds you feel." The breeze rustled the leaves, carrying his words outward, mingling with the natural world. Ananda leaned forward, seeking clarity. Master, wisdom reveals the truth, but how does mindfulness complement this in finding freedom? The Buddha's voice carried a steady assurance. Mindfulness grounds you, keeps you present, where wisdom operates. Together, they open the heart's path to liberation. Kala added, her tone curious. Master, how does compassion free us from suffering's grip? The Buddha turned to her, his gaze warm and thoughtful. Compassion redirects focus outward, softening the self's grasp. It dissolves suffering through connection and understanding. Kala nodded, a quiet resolve growing within her. As the moonlight began to filter through the leaves, the disciples felt a collective stillness settling. Mara's voice came again. Master, I feel my bonds lessening, but fear still lingers. How do we address fear's hold? The Buddha's reply carried a depth of certainty. Fear dissipates with understanding and acceptance. It is the shadow of attachment. The night deepened. The disciples sat surrounded by the serene quiet. Master, Kala spoke again, her voice light but steady. Freedom feels distant yet nearer than before. How do we sustain this journey? The Buddha's reply carried a gentle strength. Freedom is a path walked daily, each step guided by intention. The disciples rose as the gathering concluded, their expressions filled with quiet reflection. Mara approached the Buddha, his voice steady with gratitude. Thank you, Master, for guiding us. I feel lighter than before. The Buddha inclined his head slightly, his gaze kind and unwavering. And so, the teachings of the day mingled with the night air, their echoes settling in the disciples' hearts. Another day, beneath the vast canopy of the Bodhi tree, the disciples gathered again, their questions lingering from prior teachings. Kala stepped forward, her voice steady. Master, how do we gain freedom in the heart when bonds feel unyielding? The Buddha's gaze rested gently upon her. Kala, freedom in the heart arises not from force but from understanding and transformation. The breeze carried the scent of blossoms, the sounds of nature mingling with their thoughts. Kala nodded, seeking further clarity. Master, where does this understanding begin? The Buddha gestured to the earth, his voice deliberate. It begins by seeing things as they truly are, beyond illusion and attachment. Mara joined the dialogue, his voice calm yet curious. Master, how do we cultivate this vision of truth? The Buddha smiled faintly, his tone unwavering. Wisdom, mindfulness, and compassion are the tools. Together, they reveal truth and open the heart's path. Ananda's expression brightened as he asked, Master, how do we practice wisdom in daily life? The Buddha inclined his head slightly. Wisdom arises from observing reality without distortion and from questioning assumptions and beliefs that bind the mind. The disciples fell silent, absorbed in his words. Mara then spoke, his voice firm. Master, mindfulness seems fleeting. How do we ground ourselves in it? The Buddha's gaze swept across the group. Mindfulness is cultivated by returning to the present moment again and again. With patience and practice, Kala leaned forward, her tone curious. Master, how does compassion transform the heart's bonds? The Buddha's face softened as he replied. Compassion shifts focus outward, dissolving self-centered attachments and freeing the heart through connection and understanding. The group reflected quietly, the depth of his teachings settling in their minds. The Buddha pointed to the moonlit pond nearby, its surface calm and reflective. Observe the water. It reflects without clinging or resisting. This is the nature of freedom. Ananda nodded thoughtfully, his gaze on the pond. Master, how do we apply this reflection to our inner lives? The Buddha's voice carried warmth and clarity. Learn to observe thoughts and emotions without clinging or aversion. Like the pond reflects the sky above. Mara spoke next, his tone reflective. Master, fear often arises when observing emotions. How do we address this fear? The Buddha's gaze rested on Mara, his tone steady. Fear dissolves with understanding. It is the shadow of attachment and fades through acceptance and clarity. The disciples exchanged glances, their expressions filled with reflection. Kala asked, "Master, can the heart truly be free of all attachments?" The Buddha's voice lifted slightly. Freedom does not mean absence of connection but absence of bondage. It is the heart's openness to truth. The night deepened, the moonlight casting shadows that danced gently on the ground. Ananda asked again, "Master, how does transformation begin in the heart?" The Buddha gestured to the group. It begins with intention. When the heart seeks truth sincerely, transformation arises naturally. Mara added, his voice quiet but steady, "Master, intention feels difficult to sustain. How do we nurture it?" The Buddha's reply carried gentle strength. Intention is nurtured through practice, support, and reflection. It deepens with time and persistence. The disciples nodded, absorbing his wisdom. Kala asked, her tone firm yet reflective, "Master, what follows transformation in the heart?" The Buddha's eyes brightened slightly. Freedom follows. Transformation removes illusion, allowing the heart to open fully to life and truth. The disciples sat quietly, the stillness blending with the sounds of the night. Mara's voice came softly, "Master, I feel my heart lighter, yet uncertainty remains. How do we address it?" The Buddha's gaze rested on Mara, his tone compassionate. Uncertainty arises from clinging to answers. Embrace it as part of the journey, and it becomes a teacher. The moonlight reflected on the pond, its ripples catching the light. Kala asked, "Master, how do we sustain freedom once found?" The Buddha's reply carried depth and assurance. Freedom is sustained through daily practice, rooted in mindfulness, wisdom, and compassion. Ananda smiled faintly, his expression relaxed yet thoughtful. "Master, this practice feels vast. How do we know where to begin?" The Buddha gestured to the group. "Begin where you are, with small steps. Each moment offers an opportunity to practice freedom." The disciples rose gradually, their hearts lighter yet thoughtful. Mara approached the Buddha, his tone filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Master, for guiding us." The Buddha inclined his head slightly, his gaze steady and kind. The teachings of the day settled in the disciples' hearts, their journey continuing. "Rahula," Buddha said, "the world's pace need not dictate your own. Stillness is yours to cultivate, regardless of its surroundings." Thank you for watching. Buddha's teachings are always with you. Subscribe to our channel and we will see you in the next video.